Hi, hello, and welcome to my desktop view. Today we're going to be ranking baked Gelée eyeshadows together with my friend Claudia from BoB Mindset. So I'm also going to do the video in the same style that she always does it, which is desktop view, just focusing on the eyeshadows. And today of all days, it's really completely irrelevant for you to see my face. We are just going to talk about eyeshadows. So I actually think this is also the most pragmatic way to approach this video. But the idea is that we are each going to sort of like rank our favorite baked Gelée formulas from least favorite to most favorite. Now I will mention how I'm going to do this video in a little bit, but first I wanted to introduce Claudia for those of you who may not be familiar with her. I believe most of you who follow my channel for a while are very well familiar with BoB Mindset, but if you have, just started following my channel and you have no idea who I'm talking about, Claudia is one of my favorite people here on YouTube. She and I actually met on Instagram many years ago, and I have learned so much about different eyeshadow formulations and, paying attention to little nuances in formulas. I've really learned so much from her in terms of these little small details, because something you will learn very quickly about Claudia if you go check out her channel is that she has a very distinctive critical eye, and she does not hold back on her opinions, which is one of my favorite things about her. I feel like nowadays, especially on beauty YouTube, there's a huge lack of people with critical thinking, and because of that I think she's such a valuable addition to beauty YouTube. So I strongly recommend that you go and follow her channel. Of course, I'm going to link her video and her channel in the description box below, so you can check it out as soon as you're finished with this video, or honestly just click away from my video and go watch hers, because it's probably going to be much more informative. But we've been talking about doing this collab video for a while now, because the thing is, if you know Claudia and I, you will know that we are both obsessed with baked Gelée eyeshadow formulas, and I'm going to quickly explain what those are in a little bit. But the idea is that over the course of our interactions, we have come to the realization that we enjoy different things about baked Gelée formulas, so we don't necessarily even enjoy the same type of baked Gelée formulas. So we thought it would be interesting to sort of each have our take on what our favorite baked Gelée eyeshadows are on the market, and present you with our perspective and why certain formulas excite us more than others. In fact, there are only a select, number of brands which even offer baked Gelée eyeshadows. So I think this is a really good plugin for me to tell you that Claudia made a video where she created this Google Doc where you can go and search by brand, by tier of brand. Such a valuable resource. If you are interested and you don't know where to start, then I highly recommend that you go and watch her video. Now, I will also link our previous video which we did, I think, a year ago, where we talked about our favorite luxury eyeshadows, which didn't only cover baked and baked Gelée formulas, but basically everything within the luxury realm that we enjoy. I know a lot of you are aficionados and you don't need an explanation into baked Gelée formulas, but just in case you are someone who is completely new to eyeshadow formulas, you have no idea what I'm talking about, I figured it's maybe good to start with a couple of introductory words on the different types of formulas that you can even find in eyeshadow. I just think it's important, because I think for you to be able to follow the video, you need to sort of understand what we are talking about here. So I'm quickly going to introduce some of the basics on just eyeshadow formulas out there, and I'm going to start with the most classic type of eyeshadow, which is just a pressed eyeshadow in a pan. And we're talking, I just grabbed something random here from my drawers. So for example, this is a little palette here that I have from NARS. This is the Climax palette. But what you will notice here is that the eyeshadows are housed in little metal pans that you can see the outlines of here at the edge of the well. And these eyeshadows are essentially powders. Most eyeshadows are really some sort of a configuration where you have some sort of a silicone, you have a pigment, you have micas for the pearl if it's a shimmery eyeshadow, or just pure pigment if it's a matte eyeshadow. Then you have binders in there, and this is just pressed into a pan and left to, I believe, dry just like that until it gets this shape. So they're just really just pressed, they're left to dry, and I think that's basically it. Then we have another category of eyeshadow, and I would say that the Lancome eyeshadow queens belong to this category. So this is more of a creamy texture that is again poured into the pan, and I'm not really sure how exactly it is processed, but it has a more creamy texture compared to a classic pressed eyeshadow. A classic pressed eyeshadow has a very usually very dry feel to it, unless it's a metallic which is full of silicones. This, on the other hand, has quite a creamy feel to it, but it is still a powder. So this is what I would call your classic cream to powder formula, and these don't necessarily come in a metal pan. but they're also not baked. So this is a different beast of eyeshadow formula compared to the classic pressed eyeshadows. And I don't obviously know the ins and outs of how these are made because I am not a cosmetic chemist. I've tried to, you know, find information about how these eyeshadows are made. So really what I'm telling you here is sort of like a summary of what I've been able to gather from, you know, my searches on Google. So what is a baked eyeshadow? It's really quite simple. It's exactly what the term implies. It's an eyeshadow that has been baked into an industrial oven. So it's very easy to recognize, for example, classic baked eyeshadows because they have a very like domed texture to them, and I will give you a couple of examples here that I have gathered from different brands. And then besides the classic baked eyeshadows, you have the baked Gelée eyeshadows, and what distinguishes the baked Gelée formula from the classic baked formula is that the starting material is somewhat different from the classic baked eyeshadow. As the starting material in a baked Gelée eyeshadow has a somewhat different texture to begin with, is because it is much more gel-like, and I think after that point the processing of the two types of formulas is exactly the same. They're just poured onto a grid and baked into an oven. But you know, this is where really my knowledge and interpretation of the two types of formulas stops. Let me show you a couple of examples here. So these are two eyeshadows that I have from one of the original kits from McGrath Labs. This is, I think, from the Ultra Sway Brown kit. And I have the eyeshadows in Dark Matter and Mercury. If you look very closely, do you see how the pan has a little bit of like that raised dome? Pretty much all baked eyeshadows have this look to them. So let's take another example. This is a quad that I have from Chanel. This is their, what was this called? Something with Nuit. This is Eclat de Nuit. It was a limited edition quad that was released in the beginning of this year. And once again, you will notice the exact same thing about the, you know, the shape of the pans. They have this like raised domed shape to them. The reason these baked formulas are so coveted and so expensive to make and so luxurious feeling is because they just have a completely different feel when you apply them on your skin. Because of that like lightweight texture to them, they don't create any sort of like heaviness or additional texture on your skin. They apply in a very lightweight manner. You can build them up, you can shear them down. So there is a lot of, you know, flexibility in the way you're going to use this type of formula. So I just wanted to show you. Let's compare a classic metallic eyeshadow. So I'm going to pull out my NARS quad again, and I'm just going to take this metallic eyeshadow here. And let's compare that to something like, for example, the Mercury pigment from McGrath Labs. And I wish you were able to touch, because once you touch these eyeshadows, you will know exactly what I mean with a much smoother, lightweight feel to the texture when it comes to the baked formula. And then let's take this shimmery eyeshadow here from the Eclat de Nuit quad. I don't know whether just by looking at my finger, you can see how much more. It's not heavy and textured, but it has more body. Like this pressed formula, this like classic pressed shadow formula has much more body to it. So when you apply an eyeshadow like this on your lids, especially if you have texture on your lids, this is going to emphasize the texture a little bit more. Unfortunately, that's the name of the game. So let's quickly swatch the eyeshadows. And I have to say, the NARS formula is very, very luxurious and I'm really fond of it. But I'm hoping that you can even appreciate from the swatches how much more lightweight and texture-free this baked formula applies compared to your classic pressed eyeshadow formula. But I think it's important to remember that these eyeshadows are not going to apply with the same amount of punch and power as a classic pressed eyeshadow. So if you're coming from Clionadh eyeshadows and you expect a baked eyeshadow to behave in the same way on your lids, you're going to be disappointed, because these are much more lightweight, buildable textures. They're not going to create the same kind of like punch as a Clionadh eyeshadow would. So I think it's really all about expectations and knowing what kind of formula you're working with, and remembering that you cannot compare apples and pears. And just as a recent example, I wanted to briefly touch on the new Patrick Ta duos, because I think they've caused a lot of outrage on the internet, because I think people just simply don't understand that these eyeshadows are baked gelée. So they're the type of formula we're going to talk about in a little bit, but they are a much more luxurious, much more expensive formula to make. They're exclusive, I think, to a couple of laboratories in Italy which specialize in making those baked eyeshadows. So you cannot really compare classic pressed eyeshadow or I don't know, a Cleona eyeshadow to those new Patrick Ta duos, because you are literally comparing two completely different categories of eyeshadow. I think it's really important to remember that when you talk about eyeshadows, you're not just talking about color, you're talking about different types of formulas and different tiers of formulas. You cannot compare a classic pressed eyeshadow with a baked Gelée eyeshadow. I feel like, for example, this is a classic baked Gelée formula. This is from Bobbi Brown. This is one of her Luxe eyeshadow quads that I purchased earlier this year. You will notice that, again, this formula doesn't have a metal pen around it. These are basically stuck inside the pen, and if you ever go through an eyeshadow like this, you will see underneath that grid over top of which they are baked. And you will see that once again they had this like beautifully domed structure to them. The classic baked formula is very, very lightweight, and it has that like veil-like texture to it, whereas the baked Gelée formula, because of the gel texture, the gel-like texture, can feel much more substantial. They both are very lightweight on the lid, but they have a slightly different feel if you touch them. So now that we've covered the basics a little bit, I'm going to introduce you to the brands that I currently have in my collection that offer baked Gelée formulas in their portfolios. And those are Sisley, Dior, Tom Ford, Bobbi Brown, Guerlain and Pat McGrath Labs. Or at least these are the brands that I currently have in my collection which are of baked Gelée texture. And I'm going to talk about each individual brand, and I'm going to sort of start with the ones that I enjoy least and then talk about the ones that I enjoy most, so that we sort of keep this in the context of a ranking. So let's start with the eyeshadow formulas that I would currently rank as my least favorite in my collection, and that is offered by Dior. And again, I want to say I'm talking about the specific formula of the two queens that I'm going to show you in a little bit, because even within the range of Dior, baked Gelée formulas can vary quite a bit, but this specific type of baked Gelée formula that was offered with their spring collection for 2024 is just my least favorite, and I want to touch upon why. So the two queens that I will be talking about today are, like I said, from their spring collection. This is Coral Flame and this is in the shade Pastel Glow. Now, gorgeous color stories, and if I'm being entirely honest, I actually really like Pastel Glow because I think it is such an interesting and unique color story with some of these beautiful ethereal like pastel shades in here. Now, I'm going to swatch a couple of the eyeshadows for you, and I'm going to try to explain how this formula feels to me. This formula feels like a classic baked Gelée eyeshadow, but to me, it also feels quite powdery, and I think you can see a little bit of that powderiness over here on my finger where I gathered quite a bit of dust. And it could be because I dug my finger into it, but it has been my overall impression that this specific formula that is present in these two queens in particular, like I said, that is also not indicative of all of their baked Gelée eyeshadow formulas, because I think for the holidays they actually have a baked Gelée formula that is different to this one. But this specific one was not impressive to me because of this powdery aspect to it. It's lightweight, it's beautiful on the lids, but it has a powderiness that I do not enjoy. They are still beautiful eyeshadows, like I said. I'm not saying that I don't like them. It's just that comparatively speaking to some of these other baked Gelée formulas that I have here that I will talk about in a sec, these happen to be a little bit too powdery for my taste. And because they're a little bit too powdery, I feel like they're very hard to build. They don't really stick to the lids very well, and they are in the danger of being, you know, brushed away when you blend them. A classic baked Gelée eyeshadow that is not of this powdery nature sticks really well to your lids, and you're not just going to like brush it away when you are blending it. Whereas this, because it's so powdery in nature, tends to blend itself away, and I don't really like that. The next eyeshadow I want to talk about very briefly is this Sisley single eyeshadow that I have here in the shade Silky Chestnut. Now, this is one of the reasons that I find it very difficult to do a ranking video, because based on the position which we're going to discuss this eyeshadow at, it would appear as if I don't like this eyeshadow. Same for the Dior ones, by the way. I like them, it's just that on the spectrum of baked Gelée, this is a little bit less impressive to me. But also, I want you to keep in mind that if you go to the Sisley counter and you swatch these baked Gelée eyeshadows from them, you are going to notice that some of them have a much more sparkly nature to them. And the reason I rank this eyeshadow a little bit lower is because it's more of like a satin formula, and that's something that probably should be said about these ones from Dior. They're a satin formula. There isn't a lot of like flakiness and glitteriness to them, and that is something that I do actually enjoy quite a bit. And I think that is also the reason that I would rank the Sisley eyeshadow a little bit lower, even though I think the eyeshadow color is gorgeous, and you will see that there is really no powderiness or kick up over here. And I think this specific eyeshadow also has a very unique color to it. It's like a rosy brown that is quite difficult to come across because it has a beautiful like rosy coolness to it. You can see that it applies beautifully. It is very smooth, but there is no dimensionality to it. And that's of course not to say that if I hadn't picked one of the Sisley eyeshadows that have a little bit more sparkle to them, I wouldn't have ranked it higher. It's just that the one eyeshadow that I have from them happens to be in this more satin finish. Okay, next we're going to talk about the wet and dry formula from Tom Ford, and here we are already stepping into, you know, somewhat more impactful territory, but a formula that stands for me somewhere in between my least favorite and my most favorite. This is a gorgeous baked gelée formula, and again it has that smoothness to it, that lightweight feel. These eyeshadows also have a subtle sparkle to them, but a subtle sparkle. I think you can already tell just based on the swatches how much more, you know, body and presence there is in this formula compared to something like the Dior. You cannot go wrong with the Tom Ford quad in the wet and dry formula. So it's really important also to remember, if you're looking at Tom Ford quads, he has now quite a variety of different textures. He has like the classic pressed eyeshadows, he has the new cream, I don't know how they're called, the cream color quads. I don't have any of those. I think those are more of like that cream to powder formula that I mentioned with the Lancome eyeshadows. The wet and dry formula you can recognize by the fact that it has the Tom Ford logo imprinted into the pan. Now, unfortunately, I want to say that maybe that is also the case for the cream color quads, so that's no longer a good indication of whether you're buying the wet and dry formula. But in case you're interested in trying his baked gelée formula and you don't want to be fooled into buying one of his other formulas, do a little bit of research before you buy, because he doesn't only have wet and dry, he also has other textures in his eyeshadow formula portfolio. Now, the reason I'm not ranking the Tom Ford formula higher is because he basically only has that one type of eyeshadow formula in his baked gelée. They are all this like beautiful satin with a subtle sparkle to it. There is no versatility in the types of formulas that you get, which is something that you experience with the other two brands that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So just due to the lack of versatility in his baked gelée formula textures, I am ranking him a little bit more, you know, midway. Really solid, but you are basically getting a one-trick pony. Now let's talk about my second favorite baked gelée eyeshadow formula, and that is one that is offered in the original 6 quads that are offered by Guerlain. There were a couple of limited edition quads that were also in the baked gelée formula, but I cannot stress this enough. Since the spring of 2023, Guerlain hasn't made a single quad that is in this baked gelée formula. They are classic, you know, pressed powders now. So unfortunately, this formula is quite limited to the range of the 6 quads that are currently offered in their, you know, regular line, and the couple of limited edition quads that you may or may not be able to find. I don't have any of the limited edition quads, but I do have 4 out of the 6 of the original range of these baked gelée eyeshadows from Guerlain, because they are some of my absolute favorites out there, and I want to tell you why. I've actually pulled out another one of these quads here because I want to illustrate with a couple of examples what I think is so special about the baked gelée eyeshadow formulas from Guerlain. So in many ways, the baked gelée eyeshadows from Guerlain are comparable to the ones from Tom Ford. However, unlike the Tom Ford formula, you get more versatility with the types of textures that are present in the Guerlain quads. For example, something that you're not going to find in the Tom Ford formula is matte eyeshadows in this baked gelée texture. And there are 2 eyeshadows in here that are in that gorgeous matte formula. So this is the black and the dark brown. I freaking love the texture of these matte eyeshadows. However, I cannot stress this enough. Many of you have told me that you find this formula very difficult to work with and you don't like it. Because what is very interesting about the matte eyeshadow formula from Guerlain is that it feels like a creamy latex texture. I always describe it as a latex texture because this is the closest, you know, tactile experience that comes to mind when I touch this eyeshadow formula. It's quite hard pressed in the pan, it has a very creamy feel to it, there is no powder kick up here, but because of that they might be a little bit harder to pick up on a brush and they are of much more buildable nature. You're not going to get a kapow pigment out of a matte eyeshadow like this when you compare it to something that is in a standard pressed powder formula. But that is exactly why I love these eyeshadows. They are very buildable, you can play around with the intensity of the color on your lids. You can apply them as a wash of color, you can mix them with other, you know, colors to create your custom colors. They work beautifully as a liner because they never, you know, cause any sort of fallout on your face, and they just look so incredibly smooth on the lids. This is one of the most flattering matte eyeshadow formulas that I have ever put on my eyelids. I absolutely love them. Now, another type of texture that is present in these quads is what I would call the Tom Ford Wet and Dry formula. So let's say something like this beautiful brown shade here, or this gorgeous cooler toned, you know, silvery purple. You see how beautiful and dimensional they are. They have the same kind of like strong body to them as the Tom Ford Wet and Dry formula, but they're very different in texture to the matte eyeshadows. And finally, another type of texture that you are going to find in some of these Guerlain quads is what I would call their sparkly eyeshadows. So a texture that really isn't present in the Tom Ford Wet and Dry formula, and I think makes these Guerlain quads so incredibly beautiful and versatile. The fact that you have all these different textures in just like the 4 eyeshadow palette format. So for example, these two from Imperial Moon and from Royal Jungle, they don't have, you know, intense glitter to them, but they're really beautiful, sparkly and dimensional. They can be used as toppers, they can be used on their own, and it's exactly this kind of versatility in the textures of these Guerlain quads that I really enjoy, and why I rank them so high and why I cannot shut up about them. Let's talk about the Baked Gelée eyeshadows that rule them all, and these are the Baked Gelée eyeshadows that are present in the Mothership palettes from Pat McGrath and the Luxe eyeshadow formula of Bobbi Brown. These are essentially the same formula. Okay, that's why I'm putting them in the same, you know, ranking position, because to me, in terms of formula, they are exactly the same, even though they come from different brands. So let's quickly open up this formula and also talk about it. So I've taken a representative here of the Mothership palettes. This is Mothership 1 Subliminal, and I've spoken about the architecture of Mothership palettes before and quite extensively about the different types of formulas that are present in the Mothership palette. So if I don't forget, I'm actually going to link the video somewhere up here for you so that you can watch it. But essentially, if you grab a Mothership palette, and especially you grab Motherships 1 through 9, in the right corner of the palette you will have this quad of eyeshadows which are Baked Gelée, and what we here like to refer to as the Blitz Astral formula. It's the Blitz Astral formula simply because Pat McGrath Labs have named them, you know, Blitz Astral, and there's also the VR eyeshadow formula. They are not technically called the Blitz Astral eyeshadow. So for example, even though Bobbi Brown doesn't really call this formula Blitz Astral formula, I refer to it as a Blitz Astral formula because it is essentially the same as, you know, in the Mothership palette. And now I'm realizing that Mothership 1 is maybe not the best example of the different types of textures that are present in here, so I'm going to grab another one. So I want to touch upon that quickly just because there's a lot of confusion out there about this as well. Motherships 1 through 9 are the only motherships out there which have Baked Gelée formulas. Mothership 9 doesn't even have 4 of them, it only has 3 of these Baked Gelée formulas. The rest of the motherships since then have not had a single baked eyeshadow in them, just FYI. So, why is this formula my most favorite? Well, this formula is my most favorite because it is the most impactful, the most dimensional, the most glittery, the most sparkly, and you can just create the most beautiful effects with these eyeshadows. The smoother satin formulas that I've shown from the other brands, they're gorgeous, but they don't have the same kind of versatility in terms of use that some of these eyeshadows over here have. Now, I'm not going to pay too much attention to the baked matte here in the BoB Brown quad. I was first introduced to this formula when I started purchasing these like luxe quads from BoB Brown, and you can see even based on the swatch, they are rather gently pigmented. So this formula clearly doesn't translate into a very pigmented or very buildable matte eyeshadow, so it's not necessarily my favorite to have in here. I enjoy having it because it's an interesting experience, but you cannot compare, for example, the baked formula that is present in here with the baked gelée. Sorry, they're both baked gelée, but you cannot compare, for example, the one from Guerlain with this one. This is very gently pigmented, and honestly to me it almost behaves like those classic baked domed eyeshadows, whereas this has that like latexy feel to it, and because of that it has also much more pigment and body to it. It has buildability, but this is much more lightweight, much more like a veil, whereas this actually has, you know, substance to it. You get a variety of different textures within this baked gelée formula, because some of them are going to be very smooth and more on the satin side, some of them are going to be quite flaky and quite sparkly, and some of them are going to have a texture that is somewhat in between. It is not quite a satin, but it is also not quite like a flaky sparkly shade, but it does have a lot of dimensionality and sparkle to it. So let me give you a couple of examples. Within the Pat McGrath eyeshadow palette, for example, she very often calls these like satin eyeshadows that don't have sparkle to them her Blitz formula. So for example, you have Blitz Flame here from Mothership 5, and I believe a similar eyeshadow from the BoB Brown quad is this one here, which is also not a very sparkly eyeshadow. It's a duochrome, it's a beautiful eyeshadow, but it has a smoothness and pigmentation to it that is not to be likened to something that is a little bit more flaky and more sparkly. These are absolutely beautiful eyeshadows. The next type of formula, like I said, is that in-between formula, which doesn't quite have, you know, that dry flaky texture to it. It's much smoother to the touch, but it also has a bit more of flake and a bit more of, you know, glitter and dimensionality. So this is what Pat McGrath usually refers to as the VR formula. So this, for example, is VR Fire Opal, and this eyeshadow from BoB Brown, which is called Incandescent, has a dupe within Pat McGrath's Pat McGrath Labs range, and the eyeshadow that this is a dupe for is VR Nectar from Mothership 2 Sublime. So these are already like a step up. They still have a very smooth texture to them, but there's a little bit more flake, and there is, you know, that gorgeous dimensionality because of the glitter. I hope that this is really coming across on camera. Also, the light is hitting it in the right way, so I'm really hoping that you can see this. So this eyeshadow type, for example, this kind of baked gelée eyeshadow, and you know, most of these Tom Ford eyeshadows, they serve as lid colors. They have substance to them. They have substance to them, they have color, they have pigment. So this is something that I would refer to as something that you put on your lid as sort of like a base color. Now we are getting into the range of textures that you can use as toppers. So something like this formula can easily serve as a lid shade, but you can also apply this kind of formula over top of something like this to give it a bit more sparkle and dimensionality. So let's say we grab this shade here from the BoB Brown quad, the shade Incandescent. We can layer it over top of something like the smoother texture that immediately creates this gorgeous, you know, dimensionality to the color without adding any additional texture to your lids. It just still looks smooth and gorgeous and, you know, flattering on the skin, and that is really the true power of this baked gelée texture. It is so incredibly smooth on the lid, it's so lightweight, and because of that dryness to the formula, it allows for you to be able to layer textures like this over top of each other without creating texture on your skin. Finally, we have the highest tier of sparkle and the highest tier of, you know, flakiness when it comes to the actual texture. And you can just see on my finger there's a little bit more, you know, of that dry, flaky texture. These are the most sparkly eyeshadows within this range. They serve the same kind of purpose. You can use them as, you know, standalone lid shades. They're going to have a bit of like a translucency to them, so they're not going to have a lot of like base pigment to them. They will have a bit of translucency and they will look like that gorgeous like fairy dusting on the lids, but they can also be layered over top of any of these other textures to create that kind of that same kind of, you know, dimensionality. This is, you know, jam-packed full of glitter. And we're talking about glitter that is composed of either micas or synthetic micas. I think most luxury modern formulas actually have synthetic micas in them. So for example, synthetic fluoroflogopite is a synthetic mica. They also have a lot of these like calcium borsilicate type of ingredients to them, which also create that kind of, you know, intense sparkly effect. So this is not, you know, regular mica, and it is also not pat glitter. So it's very important to make a distinction between also like the sophisticated sparkle that comes from a glitter like this compared to, you know, cheap glitters like the polyethylene terephthalate, like pat glitters. Those are completely different types of glitters. So again, you cannot compare something like this to a sparkly eyeshadow from, you know, a brand that uses pat glitters instead of those like synthetic micas or mica. I stand by my ranking because this ranking really like reflects my personal taste when it comes to how I do my eyeshadow, but I'm sure that Claudia will have her own perspective on it because I think we do our eye makeup slightly differently. So honestly, I'm super curious what her ranking of these baked gelée eyeshadows is going to look like, in what format she's going to do it, and you know, what kind of interesting things I'm going to learn again by watching her video, because I always learn something interesting when I watch her videos. Please check out Claudia's video and subscribe to her channel, because I can assure you, you're going to learn so much about eyeshadows and, you know, nuances in formulas if you follow her channel. Do let me know what your personal ranking of baked gelée eyeshadows is. Which ones are your favorites? Which ones are your least favorites? Why? Which ones do you think I will like that I haven't tried yet? Yeah, I would love to have a discussion about this in the comment section below with you. As usual, thank you so very much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!